An old man rescued an otter tangled in a fishing net, but no one expected what happened after. Harold Peterson's arthritic knees protested as he made his way along the rocky Maine coastline, the same path he'd walked every morning for the past 40 years. At 72, he wasn't as spry as he used to be, but he refused to give up his dawn ritual. The salty air and solitude were all he had left since Martha passed 2 years ago. The December morning was gray and bitter, with a biting wind that cut through his wool coat. Most sensible folks were still in bed, but Harold had always believed the best discoveries came to early risers. Today would prove him right. He almost missed it at first, a slight movement among the tangles of seaweed and debris left by the previous night's storm. But then he heard it, a weak chittering sound that seemed out of place among the usual morning chorus of seabirds. "What in the world?" Harold mumbled, carefully picking his way closer over the slippery rocks. His breath caught when he saw it, an adult river otter, hopelessly entangled in what appeared to be an abandoned fishing net. The creature's dark eyes met his, filled with fear but also something that looked surprisingly like exhaustion. Harold's training kicked in immediately. Before retiring, he'd spent 30 years as a marine biologist at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. He'd seen plenty of animals caught in fishing gear, but usually, they were long dead by the time anyone found them. "Easy there, friend," he murmured, slowly reaching into his coat pocket for his Swiss Army knife, a tool he'd carried daily since his Boy Scout days. The otter watched him warily but didn't struggle, perhaps too tired from fighting the nets all night. As Harold assessed the situation, he could see that the otter was male and in otherwise good condition. Sleek fur, good weight, probably 3 or 4 years old. But the netting had cut into several places, leaving angry red marks across its body. "This is going to take some doing," Harold said softly, pulling out his cell phone. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the number for Jenny Watson, the local wildlife rehabilitator. It went straight to voicemail. The otter made another pitiful sound, and Harold knew he couldn't wait. The tide was coming in, and the rocks would soon be underwater. Drawing on decades of experience handling marine life, he shrugged off his coat and carefully approached the trapped animal. "I know you're scared," he said in the same gentle tone he'd once used with injured seals, "but I'm going to help you if you'll let me." What happened next would later make Harold question everything he knew about wild animals. Instead of trying to bite him, a natural reaction he'd expected, the otter remained still, those intelligent eyes fixed on Harold's face as he began carefully cutting away the netting. It took nearly 40 minutes of delicate work. Harold's fingers grew numb from the cold, and his back screamed in protest at the awkward position, but he kept at it. Finally, the last strand came free, but the otter didn't immediately flee as Harold expected. Instead, it stayed there, attempting to clean its wounds but clearly struggling. Blood matted its fur in several places, and Harold could see it favoring its left front paw. "You're not going to make it on your own like that, are you?" Harold sighed, knowing what he had to do. Carefully, he wrapped the otter in his coat, surprised again when it offered minimal resistance. The creature seemed to understand it needed help. The walk back to his weathered cottage took twice as long as usual, partly because of his precious cargo and partly because his joints had stiffened in the cold. By the time he reached his door, the sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across his front porch where Martha's rocking chair still sat empty. As Harold carried the injured otter into his house, he had no way of knowing that this rescue would not only save the animal's life, but would also set in motion a chain of events that would transform his own life and his entire coastal community. Harold hadn't had a house guest since Martha's sister visited last Christmas, and he certainly hadn't expected his next one to be a wounded otter. After setting up a makeshift recovery area in his enclosed sun porch using old towels and a large plastic storage bin, he finally managed to reach Jenny Watson. "Harold Peterson, you did what?" Jenny's voice crackled through the phone's speaker. "You know it's illegal to keep wildlife without proper permits." "I know the laws, Jenny," Harold replied, watching the otter through the porch window. "But this fellow needed immediate help. He's got some nasty cuts, and I'm worried about infection." Jenny sighed. "I'm stuck in Portland at a wildlife conference until tomorrow. Can you keep him stable until then? Use the first aid protocols we learned in that workshop last spring? Harold felt a flutter of relief. Jenny had been teaching wildlife rehabilitation workshops to local retirees, though he'd attended more out of boredom than expectation of ever using the knowledge. I've got my old vet kit from the research days, he said. I'll do my best. After hanging up, Harold gathered his supplies. Antibiotic ointment, sterile gauze, and the special gloves he'd kept just in case. To his surprise, the otter remained remarkably calm as he cleaned and dressed the wounds, only flinching occasionally when Harold touched particularly tender spots. You need a name, Harold mused as he worked. Can't keep calling you fellow. How about Edison? You seem pretty bright. The otter Edison watched him with those penetrating eyes, accepting the sardines Harold offered between treatments. By evening, the animal had settled into the makeshift habitat, though Harold noticed he seemed to prefer watching the old man putter around rather than sleeping. That night, Harold had trouble sleeping himself. Every couple of hours, he checked on his patient, using the flashlight Martha had always kept by the bed for power outages. Each time, Edison was awake, greeting him with a soft chirp. The next morning, Harold was preparing his usual breakfast of oatmeal when he heard a commotion from the sun porch. He found Edison had somehow managed to open the storage bin and was exploring the room, leaving wet paw prints on the hardwood floor Martha had so lovingly maintained. Now that won't do, Harold muttered, though he couldn't help but smile at the otter's obvious curiosity. Edison had discovered Martha's old knitting basket and was thoroughly investigating a ball of blue yarn. As Harold cleaned up the mess, his neighbor Sarah Thompson appeared at the porch window, nearly dropping her coffee mug when she spotted Edison. Harold Peterson, is that what I think it is? She called through the glass. Within an hour, despite Harold's attempts at discretion, half the neighborhood knew about his unusual houseguest. Sarah brought fish from her husband's latest fishing trip. Bob Miller from 2 doors down arrived with his grandson Tommy, both pressing their faces against the window in fascination. Mr. Peterson? Tommy asked, his eyes wide. Are you going to keep him? No, Tommy. Wild animals need to stay wild, Harold explained, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of Edison leaving. Jenny Watson will be here tomorrow to take him to the wildlife center. But when Jenny arrived the next day, things didn't go quite as planned. Edison had other ideas about his future, and his unusual behavior would soon present Harold with a dilemma he never expected to face. As Jenny approached with a transport cage, Edison did something that left both experts speechless. He moved deliberately behind Harold, pressing against his legs like a protective dog, and refused to be coaxed out. Well, Jenny said, straightening up with a puzzled expression, I've never seen anything quite like this. These are typically solitary animals, but this one seems different. Harold felt Edison's warm weight against his leg and remembered countless scientific papers he'd written about animal behavior. None of them had prepared him for this moment. Give me a few more days, he found himself saying. His wounds need more time to heal anyway. I'll bring him to the center myself when he's ready. Jenny gave him a knowing look. Harold, just remember what we talked about in the workshop. Wild animals aren't pets. But as she drove away and Edison settled contentedly next to Harold's chair, both man and otter seemed unaware of that distinction. Neither could they know that their unusual bond would soon be tested in ways neither expected, as nature and human interference conspired to challenge their growing friendship. As January's bitter winds howled outside, Harold's quiet life had transformed in ways he never imagined. Edison's presence had turned his cottage into an unlikely attraction in their small coastal town of Blue Harbor, Maine. The otter's wounds were healing nicely, but his behavior continued to puzzle everyone, especially Harold. He's not acting like any otter I've ever studied, Harold explained to Dr. Rebecca Chen, a former colleague from the Research Institute who'd come to observe Edison. They watched as the otter methodically arranged Harold's morning newspaper, something he'd taken to doing every day. Fascinating, Dr. Chen murmured, taking notes. He's displaying unusual levels of cognitive interaction and social bonding. Have you noticed any other unusual behaviors? Harold chuckled. Where do I start? He refuses to sleep in the enclosure, preferring Martha's old reading nook. He alerts me when the phone rings before I can hear it myself. Yesterday, he somehow knew Sarah was having trouble with her heart medication before she did, kept pawing at her chest and chittering until she called her doctor. Turned out her prescription had been filled incorrectly. Dr. Chen's pencil paused mid-sentence. Harold, this is extraordinary. We should document this properly. The scientific implications. No, Harold cut her off firmly. The last thing I need is Edison becoming a research subject. Besides, I'm supposed to be preparing him for release. But that was becoming increasingly difficult to imagine. Edison had developed a routine that fit seamlessly into Harold's life. Each morning, they'd share breakfast, Harold with his oatmeal, Edison with his fresh fish. Then they'd walk to the beach together, where Edison would swim while Harold collected trash from the shore, a habit he developed since the rescue. The locals had grown used to the sight of the old marine biologist and his otter companion. Children would wave from their school bus, and fishermen would save choice pieces of their catch for Edison. Even the town council had taken notice, especially after Harold and Edison's beach cleaning inspired a community initiative to protect local wildlife. However, not everyone was pleased with the situation. Harold was working in his garden one afternoon, Edison helping by digging up grubs from the soil, when Animal Control Officer Mike Dawson pulled up in his truck. Got some complaints, Mr. Peterson, Dawson said, eyeing Edison warily. Can't have wild animals living in residential areas. It's against town ordinances. He's still recovering, Harold protested, feeling Edison press against his legs. Jenny Watson is supervising his rehabilitation. You've got till the end of the week to turn him over to the Wildlife Center, Dawson replied firmly, or I'll have to take official action. After Dawson left, Harold sat heavily in Martha's rocking chair, Edison watching him with concerned eyes. What are we going to do, old friend? The answer came unexpectedly that evening. Sarah Thompson organized an emergency town meeting, and Harold was amazed to find the community center packed with supporters. Jenny Watson stood up first. As the licensed wildlife rehabilitator for this county, I can testify that this is an unprecedented case, she announced. The bond between Harold and Edison is unique, and their presence has actually benefited our community's wildlife awareness and conservation efforts. Others spoke up too. Mrs. Rodriguez from the elementary school described how weekly visits from Harold and Edison had inspired her students to start an environmental club. Local fishermen testified about how Harold's advice had helped them modify their nets to prevent wildlife entanglement. Even young Tommy presented a petition signed by every kid in his class. But it was Dr. Chen's testimony that changed everything. She proposed a groundbreaking study, documenting how controlled human-wildlife interactions could promote conservation awareness and community engagement. The town council would have to create a special permit, the first of its kind. This isn't just about one man and an otter, she explained. It's about how compassion can transform a community. As the council debated, Harold felt Edison's reassuring presence beside him. Whatever happened, he realized their friendship had already created ripples far beyond his little cottage. But neither man nor otter could predict the storm that was about to test their remarkable bond. February arrived with one of the worst nor'easters Blue Harbor had seen in decades. The weather reports grew increasingly dire as the storm approached, but few could have predicted its impact on Harold and Edison's story. The morning before the storm, Harold noticed Edison acting strangely. The otter paced restlessly, refusing his breakfast and continuously chittering while looking out toward the ocean. Harold's scientific mind battled with his growing intuition about Edison's behavior. "What is it, old friend?" he asked, watching Edison press his paws against the window. The sky was an ominous gray-green, and the waves were already higher than normal. The phone rang. It was Jenny Watson. "Harold, we're evacuating the Wildlife Center. The storm surge predictions are off the charts. You and Edison should head inland." But before Harold could reply, Edison became extremely agitated, pulling at Harold's pant leg and heading toward the door. Years of studying marine life had taught Harold to trust animal instincts. He grabbed his coat and followed. Edison led him down to the rocky shore, where the wind was already howling. At first, Harold couldn't understand what had drawn them there, until he heard it. Faint cries coming from a small cove, usually hidden at high tide. There, trapped by the rising water, was a group of seal pups, probably separated from their mothers by the strengthening storm. Without intervention, they would drown when the storm surge hit. "Good boy," Harold whispered to Edison, already pulling out his phone. Within minutes, Jenny was on her way with transport crates, and Sarah Thompson was rallying volunteers through the community Facebook group. What happened next would be talked about in Blue Harbor for years to come. As the storm intensified, Harold, Jenny, and a group of volunteers worked to rescue the seal pups. Edison, to everyone's amazement, seemed to coordinate with the adult seals who were anxiously swimming nearby, helping to calm the pups during the rescue. "He's communicating with them somehow," Jenny marveled, watching Edison guide a particularly frightened pup toward the rescuers. But nature wasn't finished testing them. As they loaded the last pup into Jenny's truck, a massive wave crashed over the seawall. Harold, who had moved closer to the edge to retrieve a dropped towel, was caught in the surge. "Harold!" Sarah screamed, but it was Edison who reacted first. Without hesitation, the Otter plunged into the churning water. The gathered crowd watched in horror as both disappeared beneath the waves. Seconds stretched like hours until finally, they spotted them. Edison, displaying extraordinary strength, was helping Harold stay afloat, guiding him toward a lower section of the rocks where the volunteers could reach them. As they pulled Harold to safety, the old marine biologist was breathing hard but conscious. Edison refused to leave his side, even as the EMTs arrived to check Harold over. "Your otter just saved your life," Jenny said softly, wrapping a blanket around Harold's shoulders. The incident made headlines beyond their small town. Hero Otter saves elderly rescuer. But it did something else too. It settled the debate about Edison's future once and for all. At an emergency town council meeting the next day, held in the high school gym because of storm damage to the town hall, the council unanimously approved a special wildlife ambassador permit. Dr. Chen's research proposal was expanded to include studying wildlife rescue techniques, with Harold and Edison as key participants. Sometimes, the council chairman announced, "We need to recognize that nature has its own plans, ones that don't always fit our normal rules and regulations." As Harold recovered from his near drowning at home, Edison kept constant vigil, bringing him the newspaper each morning and alerting Sarah whenever Harold needed anything. The bond between them had been forged even stronger by their shared ordeal. But their story was far from over. The storm had exposed serious issues with the town's wildlife protection measures, and both Harold and Edison would soon find themselves at the center of changes that would affect the entire Maine coastline. Spring arrived in Blue Harbor, bringing with it unexpected changes. Harold's cottage, once a quiet refuge for a lonely widower, had transformed into what locals now called the Edison Center for Marine Education. The sun porch, where Edison had first recovered, was now a small classroom where Harold taught weekly workshops about marine wildlife conservation. Edison, wearing his official wildlife ambassador vest, specially designed by Sarah's Quilting Circle, would demonstrate natural otter behaviors and interact with visitors in ways that continued to amaze even the most experienced researchers. "Watch this," Harold said to a group of visiting marine biology students. Edison was showing them how otters use tools, carefully cracking open clams with small rocks. "He's not just demonstrating feeding behavior, he's teaching it to younger otters we've rehabilitated." Dr. Chen's research project had expanded beyond its original scope. The Edison effect, as she termed it, was challenging conventional wisdom about wildlife rehabilitation. Under Harold and Edison's influence, successfully rehabilitated animals showed higher survival rates when released back into the wild. But their greatest impact came through their work with children. Tommy, the neighbor's grandson who had first pressed his face against the window to see Edison, had started a junior naturalist program at his school. Every Wednesday afternoon, Harold and Edison would visit, teaching kids about marine ecology and responsible fishing practices. "Mr. Peterson," Tommy asked one day, "remember when you found Edison in that fishing net? How come we still let people use those kinds of nets?" The question led to Harold's testimony before the state legislature, with Edison by his side, advocating for stricter regulations on fishing gear. Pictures of the dignified older man and his attentive otter companion made national news, bringing attention to the issue of marine wildlife entanglement. One morning, as Harold and Edison did their beach walk, they came across something that would launch their next mission. A female otter lay dead on the shore, likely due to ingesting plastic waste. Beside her, two tiny pups struggled to survive. Edison's reaction was immediate and extraordinary. He gently approached the pups, making soft chirping sounds Harold had never heard before. The pups, despite their fear, responded to Edison's calls. "Well," Harold said, already pulling out his phone to call Jenny, "looks like we're expanding our family." The rescue of the otter pups sparked a new initiative. Harold worked with local fishermen to design a system for collecting marine debris while fishing, turning potential hazards into recyclable resources. The Clean Seas project soon spread to other coastal communities. As summer approached, Harold sat in Martha's rocking chair, watching Edison teach the now healthy pups how to crack shells in the garden pond they built. Sarah brought over her famous clam chowder, settling into the other chair. "Martha would be proud," she said softly. "You've built something special here." Harold nodded, thinking of how his late wife had always encouraged his love of marine life. "Sometimes the best things in life come from our darkest moments," he replied, remembering that cold December morning that had changed everything. The sound of children's voices floated up from the beach, another school group arriving for their marine education program. Edison perked up, already heading for his ambassador vest. "Ready for another day of changing the world, old friend?" Harold asked, easing himself up from the chair. Edison chirped in response, waiting patiently as Harold gathered his teaching materials. Together, they'd found more than just companionship. They discovered a shared purpose that was gradually changing their corner of the world. 1 year after Edison's rescue, Harold stood at the podium of the newly inaugurated Blue Harbor Marine Conservation Center, a facility that had grown from the humble beginnings of his sun porch classroom. Edison, as always, sat attentively by his side, his ambassador vest freshly cleaned for the occasion. "A year ago," Harold began, addressing the gathered crowd, "I was just an old marine biologist taking my morning walk. I never expected that helping one trapped otter would lead to all of this." The center, funded by a combination of state grants and community donations, was a testament to how one act of kindness could multiply. The facility included a state-of-the-art wildlife rehabilitation unit, an educational center, and a research station dedicated to studying marine animal behavior and conservation. Dr. Chen's research had recently been published in a prestigious scientific journal, documenting what she called the Edison Protocol, a new approach to wildlife rehabilitation that incorporated controlled human interaction to improve release success rates. The two orphaned otter pups, now successfully returned to the wild, were thriving in the local ecosystem, but still made regular visits to Edison and Harold. Tommy, now president of his school's environmental club, led tours of the center's interactive exhibits. "And here," he would proudly tell visitors, "is where Mr. Peterson and Edison helped change our fishing laws." The display showed before and after photos of the coast, highlighting the dramatic reduction in marine debris since the Clean Seas project began. The center had become a model for other coastal communities. Delegations from as far away as California and Florida came to study their methods. But what made Harold most proud wasn't the national recognition or the scientific breakthroughs. It was the simple changes he saw in his community. Local fishermen now routinely reported injured wildlife instead of ignoring it. Children learned to check tide pools without disturbing their delicate ecosystems. The town's annual budget now included funding for marine conservation, something unthinkable just a year ago. After the ceremony, Harold retreated to his cottage with Edison. The otter had grown a bit grayer around the muzzle, but his eyes were as bright as ever. As they sat in their favorite spots, Harold in Martha's chair, Edison in his specially made window seat, Sarah brought over a photo album she'd compiled. "Remember this?" she asked, pointing to a picture of Harold cutting Edison free from the fishing net. Who would have thought that moment would change so many lives? The album told their story: Edison's recovery, the seal pup rescue, the dramatic storm rescue, the arrival of the orphaned pups, the groundbreaking of the center. Each photo captured a moment in their remarkable journey. That evening, as the sun set over the ocean, Harold and Edison took their daily walk along the beach. The shore was cleaner now, thanks to their efforts. Young otters played in the protected cove that had been designated as a wildlife sanctuary, and birds nested in the restored dunes. "You know, Edison," Harold said, watching a young family teaching their children how to properly observe tide pool creatures. "Martha always said everyone needs a purpose. She was right, as usual. We just needed each other to find ours." Edison chirped in agreement, then suddenly darted toward the water. Harold watched as his friend guided a young seal pup that had strayed too far from its mother back to safer waters. It was just another small act of kindness, the kind that had become routine in their lives. As they headed home in the gathering dusk, Harold reflected on how his life had changed. He was no longer the lonely widower walking the beach in solitude. He was part of something larger, a movement, a community, a family of sorts. The lights of his cottage glowed warmly ahead, and Harold could see Sarah setting up for the evening's wildlife rehabilitation workshop. Tomorrow would bring more students, more research, more opportunities to make a difference. But for now, he was content knowing that he and Edison had shown their small corner of the world what was possible when you opened your heart to unexpected friendships. "Come on, old friend," he said to Edison. "We've got more work to do tomorrow." And as they walked home together, the old man and his otter companion, their footprints mingled in the sand, a fitting symbol of how two different species could walk the same path, changing lives one step at a time.